Tonight we're beginning a brand new study. It's in the Old Testament book of Ruth. And my goal tonight is to give you a lot of the background information for the book. And then beginning next week, we're going to start chapter 1, verse 1, and go through the story of the book of Ruth. And it is a story. We just finished 2 Thessalonians. 2 Thessalonians is not a story. 2 Thessalonians is teaching instruction that Paul gives. But the book of Ruth is a story. And so we're going to try to unwrap that story as the author presents us with that. So tonight, the background information, and you may hear some things tonight and learn some things tonight that you didn't know that were connected to the book of Ruth. I learned some things in preparing this that I did not know were connected to the book of Ruth. But the book itself is about an Israelite family. It's a family that goes through some difficult times. It goes through some tragedies, and then their faith gets tested. When things go bad, will they continue to have faith in God, or will they give up their faith in God? And especially Naomi in this story is going to wrestle with her faith. So if you've ever wrestled with your faith, you're going to relate to what Naomi goes through and how she eventually resolves that faith situation. So this is a story, it's a real story of a real person going through a really difficult time trying to hang on to faith as they go through it, which we do that too, like every day. In our families and in our lives, there's something we're experiencing where our faith gets challenged. And the question is, are we going to hang on to faith in God? Are we going to have patience that God can eventually resolve this in a way in which we're blessed? And that's kind of an overview of that story. There are no prophets mentioned in the book. There's no religious institutions, no priest. At that time, there would have been a tabernacle, but it's not mentioned. This is a story of a family and their faith in God during a very difficult time in their life. So I think we can all relate to that story in one way or another. In our English Bibles, the book of Ruth follows the book of Judges. And the book of Ruth, in many ways, is a contrast to what we find in the book of Judges, which I've always been fascinated by the book of Judges because Israel had these two great leaders, Moses, who got them out of Egypt, brought them right to the edge of the Promised Land. And then there was Joshua. And I still think that the Joshua generation was the greatest generation in Israelite history in the Old Testament. I mean, for the most part, they got it right. They made a few mistakes, but for the most part, they got it right. They went into the land of Canaan, and they conquered the land. So for the first time in Israelite history, under Joshua, they have a home. They have a land. God promised Abraham, your people will have a land. And finally, in the days of Joshua, they have a land. Joshua dies, and there's not a next great leader to take his place. And it's a shame. You know, Moses, Joshua, who's the next great leader? There isn't one. And for about 300 years, the Israelites struggle. In fact, I had this presented many years ago as a sin cycle. It goes something like this. The Israelites sin. They quit worshiping God. They worship other gods. They fall away from God. They quit paying attention to God. And to get their attention, God then sends them into captivity. There's a neighbor tribe or a neighbor group that takes them captive. And life gets miserable for the people of Israel. And after enough misery, they finally call out to God. And eventually God hears the prayer, and he raises up a judge. And a judge is really a military leader. It's a general. And the judge rallies the people, and they defeat the enemy, and they win. And then there's a time of peace, a time of rest. And then they sin and fall away from God, and it repeats itself over and over again. And if you've ever read the book of Judges, you're wondering, can these guys ever just get it right? And the answer is no, they can't. In the book of Judges, they can't get it right. But in the book of Ruth, there are people of great faith. There's authentic faith in the characters. In fact, every character in the book is a person of great morality, a person of great integrity, a person who has faith in God and is faithful to God. So in many ways, the book of Ruth is like a breath of fresh air after reading Judges. Now, the book of Ruth is a remarkable book, and it's remarkable for at least three reasons. The first one is Naomi is actually the main character. The book of Ruth is really the story of Naomi. In chapter 1, Naomi faces extreme tragedy, especially for a woman back in ancient times. Her tragedy is finally resolved in chapter 4. Every character in the book of Ruth is described in their relationship to Naomi. So this is Naomi's story. Naomi is in every scene in the book except one. And in the scene where she's not present, they're talking about her. So she's there in that sense. So this is her story. But the book is called the Book of Ruth. Naomi's the main character, but Ruth is the most popular character. And because of that, the book is named after her. Whoops. The second thing is, this book is named after a woman. There are two books in the Old Testament named after a woman. Esther, that we studied a few months ago, and Ruth. The only two books named after a woman. And because it's Naomi's story, she becomes the main character, and it's kind of told from her perspective. So we're going to have to kind of crawl into her life and experience life from her perspective. The third thing is it's named after a non-Israelite. Ruth is not an Israeli. She's not an Israelite. She's a Moabite. She's a foreigner. So it's interesting that this is the only book in the entire Old Testament that's named after a non-Israelite. Ruth is mentioned 12 times in her own book. She's mentioned only once in the Bible other than in the book of Ruth. And it's interesting, it's in the Gospel of Matthew. It's in the genealogy of Jesus. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on this evening. So Ruth is described in her own book as Ruth the Moabite. So everybody knows she's not an Israelite. She's from the land of Moab. Well, moving on, the author of Ruth. Now, we just studied 2 Thessalonians, and every time Paul writes a letter, the first word of the letter is always his name. So we know immediately who writes those books. It's Paul. He identifies himself immediately. No one identifies themselves in the book of Ruth as the author of the book. So most scholars say it's anonymous because we simply do not know who wrote it. Although there are some Jewish sources who think that Samuel wrote the book of Ruth. And there's only one issue with that, and that's a timing issue. If you remember the story of Samuel, he's one of the prophets, and he's featured in especially the book of 1 Samuel, a book named after him. And Samuel and Saul become, well, let's just say that Samuel and Saul never really got along. It was always Samuel showing up to tell Saul what he did wrong. Now, Samuel does anoint David as the next king over Israel. However, Samuel doesn't live long enough to see David become the king. He dies before David actually takes the throne. And it's interesting that this is how the book ends. This is chapter 4, verse 17. It actually goes to verse 22, but it says, "The women living there said, 'Naomi has a son,' and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David." Now, whoever wrote this book knew about David. In fact, it's kind of assumed that since he's just called David, that everyone who would read this book would also know who David is. But you know, if you're actually reading the book in our English Bibles and you read Judges, then you read Ruth, You may wonder, who's David? Because David's not mentioned until 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, the next two books. So Samuel probably didn't write this book because he wasn't around to see David actually take the throne. So that kind of leaves him out. Which, by the way, I told you that Naomi was the main character. Here's a big clue in this verse. It says Naomi has a son. Naomi did not give birth to a son. That was Ruth's son. But she was from the family of Naomi. So it's Naomi who was actually the grandmother who had the son, because this is her story. She has someone to carry on the family line, which I'll talk about in just a few moments. So this is another proof, though, that Naomi is the main character in this book. Others have been suggested. Nathan the prophet has been suggested as a possible author of the book of Ruth. Some have even gone so far as to say maybe a woman wrote the book of Ruth. I mean, after all, the story is told from Naomi's perspective. But in the ancient world, there weren't too many female writers. So at the end of the day, we really don't know who wrote this book. Whoever wrote it is a great storyteller, though. They tell a fascinating story. And whoever wrote it knows a lot about the culture of Israel and also a lot about David and his family as well. Well, the date of Ruth. So if we don't know who wrote it, it's going to be difficult to know when it was written. But we do know this much. We know when the story took place. It says, in the days when the judges ruled. So this story takes place during the time of the judges. And so it's after Joshua. Joshua has died. And it's obviously before King Saul and King David. So at this point, there's no monarchy. There's no king. It's just the judges. So it happened somewhere during that time. So to put a date to that, it's somewhere around 1300 to 1100 BC. That's when the story took place. But that doesn't really tell us when it was written. Now, if we look at the last part of it, David's mentioned. And if David's mentioned with no description, apparently everybody knows who David is. So it had to have been written either when David was king or sometime after David was king, so that if you say David, everybody knows who you're talking about. The date is also tied into the purpose of Ruth. And this is where things get a little tricky and a little interesting. There are two main theories about why this book was written. Actually, there are several theories out there, but two that are popular and two that kind of make the most sense. And the first one is, this book was written to kind of enhance the acceptance of foreign women. Well, let me tell you the story. The nation of Israel. Well, the glory days were when King David was the king. And then Solomon followed David, and those two were the glory days. And then after Solomon dies, the nation of Israel more or less falls apart. I mean, under David and Solomon, they were an empire. But as soon as Solomon dies, they begin to lose power very rapidly. Eventually, the nation of Israel goes into captivity. And the nation that takes them captive is the Babylonians. It's the Babylonian Empire under King Nebuchadnezzar. And in 605 BC, that's when Nebuchadnezzar began taking Jewish people from Jerusalem, especially young, intelligent Jewish people, and moving them to Babylon so that he could teach them to become Babylonians. And one of those young men, in fact, you know 4 of those young men who were taken captive in 605 BC, was Daniel and his 3 buddies, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were 4 who were taken captive and ended up in Babylon. Finally, in 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar's army absolutely destroys Jerusalem. And the nation of Israel basically ceases to exist for 70 years. So everyone in Israel gets scattered Except those who are really old or ill or crippled, the Babylonians just left them there to die. Everyone else basically got deported elsewhere. So if you're Jewish and now you're not living in Israel anymore, maybe you're living in Babylon or you're living somewhere else in the Babylonian Empire, and you're single and you're there and you're trying to restart your life, and you want to get married. Some of these Jewish men married Gentile women. And some of these Jewish women married Gentile men. So that creates an issue, especially when Israel goes back to the land 70 years later. So 70 years later, the Persians conquer the Babylonians. And Cyrus the Persian said to the Israelites, if you want to, you can go back to your home country and restart your country all over again. Now, some of the Jewish people who had been living elsewhere for 70 years decided, I like it where I am. I'm not leaving. I'm not going back to start over a country. I have a nice house, a nice job, nice family, nice friends. I'm not leaving. But some of them did. And they restarted the nation of Israel 70 years later. So that time, that 70-year time period, is called the period of the exile. In other words, they were exiled out of their homeland and they had to live elsewhere. When they come back to the land 70 years later under the Persians, that's called the post-exilic period. So if you've ever heard that term before, meaning the exile's over, they can come back to the land and restart their nation. So they came back. And some of the men came back with a Gentile wife. And it could be that some of the women may have come back too with a Gentile husband. And Ezra and Nehemiah throw a fit that these Jewish people would actually marry Gentiles. In fact, Ezra, more than Nehemiah, tells these Israelites to divorce their Gentile wives. And that may not have gone over so well with a lot of them. And there's this whole idea that the Jewish people wanted to preserve this race of people, the Jews. And if they got intermarried with other people groups, they lose their identity over time. So that was part of it. And so, Ezra tells them, no foreign women. Why? Well, if you marry a Gentile spouse, and your Gentile spouse comes to live in the land of Israel, chances are they're going to bring their religion with them. And the Gentiles worshipped many gods and goddesses. They knew nothing about the true God of heaven. They worshipped statues. And they worshipped, anything and every place they went. There was another god or goddess that they worshipped. And so that became a threat to the religion of the Israelites. And was that a real threat? The answer is yes. Remember King Ahab? I know you know his wife. Her name's Jezebel. Jezebel was a priestess of Baal. And when Jezebel became the queen of Israel, she had a goal in mind. Convert Israel to the worship of Baal. And she did a pretty good job. She about drove Elijah the prophet crazy. Because Elijah the prophet was trying to stand up for the one true God, and he kept running into Jezebel, who was trying to convert Israel to the worship of Baal. So it was a real threat. However, Ruth is a little bit different. Ruth is not a Moabite who comes to the land of Israel to try to convert the Israelites to worship the gods and goddesses of Moab. No, Ruth, before she goes back to the land of Israel, decides that she's going to become an Israelite. And she worships and gets to know the true God of heaven. So there are some who believe that Ruth was written to convince the people that it's okay to have a Gentile spouse. Because just look at Ruth, how wonderful she is. And she's a Gentile. So that's one possibility as to why the book was written. There's a second possibility that I think is actually more accurate, and that second possibility is this book was written to present the preservation of a family that eventually produces King David. It's interesting that there's a link to David in several places in this book. It begins at the very beginning in chapter 1, verse 2, where Elimelech and his family are described as Ephrathites from Bethlehem. And then later in 1 Samuel 17, verse 12, David is called the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem. And of course, we know from the Christmas story that Bethlehem is David's city. That's where he grew up. It's also interesting that Elimelech, when the famine hits, decides to go to the land of Moab in order to survive. And David, at one point, when he was running for his life from King Saul, turned to the king of Moab and said to the king of Moab, "Here's my family. Let them stay with you and you keep them safe until it's okay for me to come back for them." So there was good relationships between the Israelites and the Moabites during the days of King David and also during this story. Now, this story has some interesting twists to it that you kind of have to know a little bit about ancient culture. In ancient culture, if you were a man, the head of your family, you did not leave your inheritance to your wife. You left the inheritance to your firstborn son. In fact, it was normal to never leave your inheritance to a female, always to a male. Now, what happens in this story is Elimelech is married and he dies. He has two sons, and obviously he left the inheritance to them. And before chapter 1 is over, they die too. So the only people left in the story at the end of chapter 1 is 3 women. So what's going to happen to the family of Elimelech? It's going to die. And that's why Naomi is so upset. Her family's going to die unless somebody marries one of the 3 of them. And one of them returns to Moab, so now there's just 2, Naomi and Ruth. Naomi figures she's too old to get married again, and that leaves Ruth. Now, there is a hero in the story. His name is Boaz, and he's described in the story as a kinsman redeemer, and we'll talk more about that term when we run into it. But basically what happens is this family of Elimelech is going to die unless somebody marries one of the women and continues the family line. And Boaz does that. He marries Ruth to continue the family line. Well, why in the world would that be so important? Well, the women living there said Naomi has a son, and they named him Obed. So Ruth and Boaz get married, and it's their son they're talking about. They give birth to a son, Ruth does, and the son's name is Obed. And Obed is the father of Jesse, and Jesse is the father of David. Now, let me give you an illustration that's a little crazy, and maybe you think like I do sometimes, and then I'll explain it again. Most of you know that I'm married to my wife, Cassie, and we have 2 daughters, Lizzie and Vicky. Every once in a while, I just think about my life, and I go, what if I didn't marry Cassie? What if I married somebody else? Well, if I married somebody else and we had children, those children would not be Lizzie and Vicky. In fact, if I married someone else and had a different family, Lizzie and Vicky would never exist. Now, I know that's after the fact and thinking backwards, but that's what this story's about. If Boaz doesn't marry Ruth, there is no King David. And if there's no King David, Israel doesn't have its greatest king. So it's interesting as you read this book. It's a story about a woman and her two sons, and her husband dies, her two sons die. There's the three women. One goes back to Moab. There's the two women. They go back to the land of Israel, and Naomi's depressed because her family's gone. And then finally this guy Boaz comes along and rescues the whole thing, and you go, wow, it's a cute story. What's the significance? Well, you have to read the last verse. Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of David. Oh my goodness. This is King David's story. And if the story in the book of Ruth doesn't happen, David doesn't exist. And that's why the book was written. And it's an incredible story how God preserves David's family 2 generations before David is even born. Because God had a plan. Interesting how the story unfolds. Well, that's the story. And it's interesting at the end. You know, Naomi at the beginning, oh, shame. Her family's going to die. But at the end in chapter 4, honor. Naomi is related to King David, Israel's greatest king. She goes from shame to honor from chapter 1 to chapter 4. Fascinating story. And it's also interesting that this book has a genealogy at the end of the book. I mean, if it would have been at the beginning, maybe we'd have had some clues as to what we were doing. But if you're just reading it, you have to get to the very last verse and you go, whoa, wait a second. This is David's story. Look what God did to preserve David's family so David could be born. Wow. So, moving on, we'll look at the genre of the book. And it's a story. Again, it's not teaching material, it's not instructions, it's not commands, it's a story. And genre is the grouping of literary works based upon their structure, their mode, their content. And as we look at the different categories, Ruth really fits in to an historical short story. It is a short story, only 4 chapters, 85 verses, so it's short. But yet it's a true story involving real people, real places, real situations, real life drama. The book begins with an historical reference. It happened in the days of the judges. It ends with an historical reference, King David's family line. So it's a true story, and it's an incredible story of what God can do in people's lives. There's also a couple features of this. Again, there's 85 verses. 59 of the 85 verses involve dialogue between characters in the story. So this is not just a narrator reading a story. These are characters talking back and forth. And that enables us to jump into the story and to experience life from their perspective. You know, what's going on with this person? And why did he say that? And why is she feeling that way? We can begin to jump into the story, and that makes the story come alive for us. So it's a fascinating story. Lots of dialogue. And then that concluding genealogy. That's the wrong place to put a genealogy. You know, there's 2 genealogies of Jesus in the New Testament. One's in Matthew and one's in Luke. And where do they occur in the book? At the beginning. And maybe not the first verses, but in the first couple of chapters. You know, they don't wait till the end of the book to put the genealogy. However, the author is very creative. He builds suspense because the reader really wants to know, okay, this is a cute story. This is a fascinating story. What's the significance? What does it really mean? What's the point? Why are you telling me this story? And at the very end, there's the answer. And now you have to go back and reread the entire story with King David in mind. Fascinating how that story unfolds. The historical context of Ruth. Well, at the very beginning, the story happens in the days of the judges. And again, Joshua and that generation, they were the best generation of Israelites in the Old Testament. But as soon as Joshua dies, it all falls apart. So the Israelites are in the land, and there's 12 tribes. But there's no central government. It's 12 tribes trying to survive on their own. Nobody has organized them. So, if the tribe of Benjamin gets attacked, it's up to the tribe of Benjamin to defend itself. It's not necessarily going to be able to rely on the other 11 tribes to come and help. So it was 12 tribes. No central government. It would be like 50 states and no central government. I mean, every state's on its own. Now, some people may actually like that. We've always debated in this country whether we should have a big federal government or a small federal government, and big states' rights or little states' rights. We've always argued that. But here for Israel during this time, nobody has organized things. It's just individual tribes trying to survive. It happens, probably this story, between 1200 and 1100 BC. So a couple hundred years or maybe less before David hits the scene. Now, at the beginning of the book of Judges, Israel is subject to Eglon, the king of Moab, for 18 years. So there was a time period when Israel and Moab were at odds with each other. And that existed for 18 years. But it appears that that's ancient history now. That was a long time ago. Now Moab and Israel are at least cordial to one another. So that's different. It's interesting how the book of Judges ends. Judges chapters 17 through 21. There's grim stories that are told. Throughout the book, Israel can't get it right. In fact, by the end of the book, they've gotten worse, not better. And why can't Israel seem to get it right spiritually, socially, and politically? Well, whoever wrote Judges tells us 4 different times. And his answer is, in those days there was no king in Israel. And whoever wrote Judges was in favor of the monarchy. And maybe whoever wrote Judges lived perhaps during the days of either David or Solomon. Because if you read the stories of the kings in the book of, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, most of the kings were bad. I mean, David happened to be the greatest king. And as long as David was king, things were really good. But most of the kings of Israel were actually bad. So whoever wrote Judges was in favor of the kingship and probably lived during a time of a great king like David or Solomon. So we're kind of set up as we begin the book of Ruth, if we're reading it chronologically. There's no king in Israel. Well, we need a king. We need a good king. And Saul turns out to be an okay, inconsistent king. One day Saul would get it right. The next day he'd get it completely wrong. The next day he'd get half of it right and the other half wrong. I mean, if you're rooting for Saul, it drives you crazy. Because you come on, man, get it right. But he can't seem to completely get it right. But David does. And here at the end of Judges, Israel needs a great king. And at the end of Ruth, there's a reference to Israel's greatest king, King David. So it kind of sets us up for that. Well, let's take a look at the title and place of Ruth in the Bible. The title is the Book of Ruth. And again, that's kind of strange, except for the fact that she is the most popular character in the book. Not the most important, but the most popular character. She's the Moabite daughter-in-law of Naomi and the eventual wife of Boaz. So, the book's named after her. And it's interesting that when it was time to asked the question, should Ruth be included in the Hebrew Bible, what we call the Old Testament? From the very get-go, it was always accepted as inspired, as a true story, as something that should be included in what we call the Old Testament. And they found fragments of the book of Ruth in Qumran. When they threw the rock into the cave and they heard the crash and they found all these manuscripts. So the book of Ruth was a very important book in the Jewish community. People loved it. And so it was very important. Also, it's interesting as we look at where Ruth ends up in our Bible. It ends up right after Judges, which makes sense because Ruth starts in the days of the Judges. The only problem with it is it ends with David, and David hasn't been mentioned yet. David doesn't get mentioned until 1 Samuel. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, they collect things a little differently. There's the Torah, the law, then there's the prophets, and there's the writings. Ruth gets included with the writings. The writings include Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. So in the Hebrew Bible, it's listed in different locations. At one point, it's listed right before the book of Psalms, which that would kind of make sense. Ruth ends with David, and most of the Psalms were written by David. So that kind of makes sense. And then it's either before or after the Song of Solomon, which Song of Solomon is kind of a romance story, and Ruth is kind of a romance story, especially in chapter 3 when we meet Boaz. So that's where it's listed in the Hebrew Scriptures as well. So it's always been accepted as part of the Bible, as part of the Old Testament. Its location, though, changed throughout the years. Well, let's look at the structure of Ruth. And this is a very well-structured story. In fact, there are 4 acts, and there's 3 scenes in each act. I've included that in your outline. This would make a fantastic play because it's easy. There's 4 acts, and there's 3 scenes in each of those acts. And usually in scene 1 of each act, there's a problem. But in scene 3 of each act, there's a solution. And it's a solution that looks forward to the rest of the story. The book is also outlined in an interesting way, and I gave you the outline that we're going to use. There's 4 acts. And literary people would call this a chiastic pattern. It's A, B, B, A. So it starts with A, which is death and emptiness. And that's in chapter 1. But then there's 2 B's in the middle that are related, and then number 4 and number 1 go together because number 4 is redemption and fullness. So the problem in chapter 1 gets completely resolved in chapter 4. And then the 2 B's in the middle are also related to one another because in chapter 2, which is Act 2, there's an immediate security that's found for Naomi and Ruth. But in chapter 3, there's a permanent security that's found for Naomi and Ruth, thanks to Boaz. So that's the story. So let me encourage you to just read the entire book. There's only 4 chapters. There's only 85 verses, and 59 of them have dialogue in them. So it should be an easy read. Read the story, and then next week we're going to start with chapter 1, verse 1, and we're going to see how this story unfolds. And tonight we've already seen that in the midst of tragedy, in the midst of something that's horrible, God can do something incredible. I mean, here was a woman in chapter 1. She loses her husband. She loses her 2 sons. And if you're a woman in the ancient world and you have no husband and no sons, you can be destitute very quickly. So it looks like life is over for her. But chapter 4, she's an ancestor of King David. And her family line gets preserved. God can bring something miraculous, incredible, wonderful out of a tragedy. I was listening to the radio today on Christian radio, and one of the DJs was telling his story about how he lost his job. He was working for secular radio, and he lost his job, and how embarrassing that was, and just how tragic that was to him and his family, because he had a wife and kids at the time. And he was going, wow, I just lost my job. What am I going to do? And eventually God called him into Christian radio. And he goes, I wouldn't be here today if I hadn't been fired back a few years ago. And God used that horrible experience, and now I'm able to do something that I absolutely love every single day. God can do that. So whatever we're going through, whatever crisis, whatever situation, God can take that and do something incredible out of it. And we're going to see how that unfolds in the book of Ruth, and you're going to see how that unfolds in your life, because you have to live through your life. And God's got great plans for all of us, and God can do incredible things even when we're going through difficult times. Heavenly Father, thank you that you're such a great God. Thank you as we've kind of have an overview of this book of Ruth. And Father, what an incredible thing that you did for a family when it looks like that family was dead and gone. But yet that family is now forever remembered as the ancestors of Israel's greatest king in the Old Testament. Father, you can take our difficulties, our tragedies, our times of just where we don't know where to turn, and you can turn those around and turn them into something great. And Father, we are so thankful that you're able to do that. And may we, like the characters in this story, remain faithful to you. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.